kind of the genesis of spirit. And right now, tonight, we have Jack Eidt and we have Matt Pallamary, and they are both here to talk about spirit in writing. And both of them have done a tremendous amount of work and travel in the underworlds of indigenous cultures in Latin America. And both of them have very unique experiences to tell us about and to share with us. So I just want to let you all know that Jack is an award-winning writer. He has won the Best Writing Award at the conference a couple years back. Matt, you all know, he's been around, he's ancient.
Around the block more than once.
He's been around the block, and then he went to the Blue House on the corner and doubled back and did it again. So he's here, and paraphrasing here. So.
Could you introduce yourself?
Yeah, who are you?
I'm that woman over there. I'm Ginger Swanson. I'm Ginger Swanson, a longtime attendee of the conference and a lover of the workshop leaders here that pour their heart and souls into helping aspiring writers find their way in the world. And I am a longtime supporter of this conference. And
an amazing, intelligent woman who just completed a PhD.
in depth psychology.
In depth psychology. And tell them your PhD thesis idea. It's so cool.
So my PhD is in depth psychology at Pacifica Graduate Institute. A year and a half ago I crossed the finish line. I went into an underworld of my own and wrote on the subject of the other woman, explored through 100 years of film, the psychic landscape of dreams and the lived experiences of Anna Ixnin and Sabina Spielrein. And I must say, in the psychic landscape of dream chapter, which is a significant part of my dissertation work, the dreams were very much influenced by the same experiences that Matt and Jack will be addressing here tonight. So it's very deep work, very dark work, very underworld work, and bringing that from the unconscious to consciousness and really delving into levels of spirit like no other. So thank you. Thank you, Dan. I'm very, very pleased to introduce Jack Eidt and Matt Pallamary discussing the spirit of writing and writing in the underworld, exploring the spirit of writing in the underworld. So if you would like to start telling us your story, Jack, if you would lead the way, about your experience in Latin America and your diving into this novel that you have just completed.
Yeah. So as she said, my name's Jack Eidt, and I majored in urban planning and environmental analysis undergraduate, but also I was a creative writing major. But I knew that I wasn't. My heart lied in writing and story. And when I moved to California when I was 17, I started going down across the border into Mexico, and it was for a 17-year-old sleeping on the beach in Rosarito, which was a different place when I was 17, unfortunately, but it's still, it was a very different world, and it was sort of a wake-up call. There was extreme poverty, which I had never seen before in Massachusetts, where I grew up, and other places in the States. But there was also a beauty and a magic there that was, and a freedom, for us 17-year-olds. We crossed from, I moved to Orange County, which was a place with a lot of borders, a lot of fences, a lot of, a way of looking at things. So I was really struck by that. And so, when I decided, I finished my master's degree in urban planning, and instead of getting a job as, a trusty city official, I threw on my backpack and headed down through Baja. And my parents, my dad said, the day before, what the hell, you're throwing away your life or your education. What are you doing? It doesn't make any sense, And I thought that I was going to, you know, have solidarity with my parents, so I had them actually drive me to Tijuana and get me on this bus, you know, and I got on this horrific, beat-up, old-school bus heading down the peninsula, and they were just like, oh my God. And for me, I believed what my father was saying, like, what am I doing? Why am I getting on this bus? And it was rough, and it was a 24-hour journey down to La Paz, and that journey really shook me. But what prepared me for the journey was reading writers who, like myself, European American background. One in particular, B. Traven, who was a German exile, but he always represented himself. He was sort of a mysterious character, but he was exiled to Mexico. And he wrote, his most famous one was Treasure of Sierra Madre, which most people know as a Humphrey Bogart and John Huston film. But he wrote the book, but he also wrote an incredible series of jungle novels, which he completely shed his own personal thing and got into the stories of the people there and the indigenous people. And the first novel of his that I read was Bridge in the Jungle, which was this incredible story just of this, and there was a gringo who got to this little indigenous village in Chiapas, and a little child was playing. There was a dance night in the middle of this great forest of Chiapas, and it was written in the 1920s. And the child died and fell off this bridge, so the Bridge in the Jungle, and it was the story of how the community dealt with that loss. And I just sat and read this book in the UCLA library from cover to cover. And so that's really what got me into this movement there. So I'll stop there. We can talk later about where I went from there.
Mm-hmm. So Matt, how did you dive into the work in Latin America, Peru, the jungle? You're living in the jungle for months on end. What inspired you? What was your turning point? What brought you to
obsession. One of the things, I've done almost every substance I can get my hands on. They got some other newer ones now, so I've probably missed a few, but I've certainly done them. And I've always had a lifelong fascination with psychedelics. And so I got really into them when I was a younger man. I grew up in Boston, Timothy Leary country. And we used to get a really good acid from this guy who went by My Favorite Martian, who was a chemist at MIT, and wild stories. But I was just getting whacked and pushing the boundaries of my conscious and experience, because and I've been told this, I'm an adventurer at heart. Well, then I took 13 years off where I didn't do anything at all. I wouldn't even take an aspirin if I had a headache. And, you know, nothing stimulating, no coffee, no caffeine, and I stayed that way for 13 years. To go baseline, so to speak. And I'm always kind of quoted as saying that if you get really whacked out enough and long enough, then when you go baseline, then baseline actually becomes an altered state. And in reality, we live altered states all the time. Waking, drinking, sleeping, even when you eat something, I mean, it's nonstop. So over time, after that break, when I was really clearing myself out, it was a spiritual thing. I got to back into this a little bit. I hope I don't go on too long, but
Go ahead.
you remember this. My first year at the Writers' Conference here, which was 1988, I got decked. I was whacked. I mean, I was out of it. They killed me. And then...
what do you mean? How did you get killed?
I got destroyed. I tried to do every workshop, every pirate, every lecture. I got rejected by an agent. I was just a wreck. You know, like 3 hours of sleep in 7 days or whatever. This doesn't work. But I found a good mentor, and she mentored me. And so I came back the next year. My second year, and I had written this story about a guy who goes into the jungle, and he goes to the shaman, and the shaman gives him some medicine and says, you have to follow the rules, and if you don't follow the rules, there's going to be problems. And he goes, great, okay, and he goes off, and he doesn't do what he's supposed to, and he ends up, because when I used to do the acid back in the day, if anybody's ever had the experience, when you're peaking, and you think it's never going to stop. And that's what the story was. He loses it, and he goes nuts and kills his girlfriend, and the paramedics come in, and he thinks they're aliens with fangs, and he dies. Anyway, this one workshop leader, Anita Kornfeld, she got up and read the story, not saying who wrote it. And I got a standing ovation, and I got a fiction award, and I was like, wow. And out of all of that, this little old lady, I'll never forget, Marjorie Livingston, PhD, was 78. She comes out to me and she had these really bright eyes, and she said, I was one of the original, I'm a PhD psychologist, and I'm one of the original LSD experimenters. I was in this big Hawaiian experiment, and I'd really love to give you my paper, and I really would like to have your story. And I'm like, of course. So I gave her the story. So like a few weeks later, she sends me these cassette tapes, and I listen. And anybody ever hear of Terence McKenna?
Oh, yes. Oh,
Yeah, well, I became very good friends with Terence McKenna, but I listen to these tapes and I hear this, well, you know, when you're doing this thing, and people always would say, you know, Mr. Rogers on acid. But he wrote his best book, in my humble opinion, called The Food of the Gods. And it was my first thought, wow, you could like do something psychedelic and it could be spiritual? Well, how cool is that? I mean, I've been baseline for 13 years, so, you know. I was also, those 13 years, I was a vegetarian for 23 years, and the jungle changed that also. But anyway, I was writing some really dark stuff. I have my Small Dark Room of the Soul, which Ray Bradbury graciously blurbed, and I was doing that kind of a thing. In fact, that story was one of the stories that was in there. And I started exploring the lycanthropy mythos. Lycanthropy is werewolves, and the basis of it is shape-shifting. And I finally had the revelation, thanks really a lot to Mr. T, Terrence, that the highest concentration, relatively speaking, in the world of not only psychedelic visionary plants, but shape-shifting mythologies were in the jungle. And then I researched ayahuasca for 10 years, and people would, they still say to me now, oh my God, you know, you're so brave, you go into the jungle. And I go, I'm not brave at all, I can't not go. I have to, I want to know what this is. So I went in and did that, and I essentially really rediscovered, in my humble opinion, true spirituality. I had the most profound experiences of my life. I have my memoir, Spirit Matters, which ends after my first. What I do now is I go in there and I do a 10-day dieta. And it's roughly, although the shaman hits me harder these days, but it would be 5 sessions over 10 days in a group. And because I've been there a lot, I do 2 by myself, and he gives me all these other plants, and I go psycho for 10 days. And then...
let me just, for those of you who don't understand the ayahuasca terrain,
Yeah.
the 10-day, can we get a little more clarity on that?
Yeah.
What is the dieta? The
Yeah.
dieta is no salt, no sugar, no sex, low spices, very bland diet, and the whole idea with that is you bland down and bland down and bland down so that whatever you ingest, particularly when you're dieting plants, you are blanding down so much that you open your psyche up to the spirit of the medicine of that plant that you, or the ayahuasca.
Or plants. The last time I was on,
Plants,
the shaman looks at me and he goes, we're going to hit you hard.
Uh-huh.
Because it really is an ordeal. It's a tough thing. But anyway, and I'll shut up and get you back on stage here. Since that time, I've been going now for 15 years, just about every year, and doing a dieta. So I've worked with numerous jungle plants. I've also been months in the Andes working with those plants. I've done the Huichol peyote pilgrimage in Mexico. Everything about me is, the whole basis of my work is all about shamanism. It's the underpinning. I'll shut up for now if you need some more time.
So let's get to him, but I just want to clarify just another minute on this dietas. So when he goes to the jungle and works with plants, it is about cleaning the system to allow the spirit. Again, this is a talk about spirit and writing, and there are a lot of inspirations that come up. I would say we can come back to that.
Yeah.
But a lot of inspiration that comes from these.
Yeah.
The awareness is brought.
I got tons of stories. In the jungle, they call ayahuasca la purga, which is the purge. And if you get a good brew and you're on this dieta, trust me, Scout's honor, it comes out both ends. But what you end up after all of that is incredibly highly clear. I could talk about that a little bit. But
Yeah, so Jack, let's hear a little bit about the spirituality aspect of your travels in Latin America. And Jack's got an experience that maybe he'll share a little bit with us tonight, where he actually had a spell cast upon him in his travels, and he writes about it in his novel. So maybe you want to, answer.
Well, yeah, I think to go from Los Angeles, where I live, to living with indigenous societies is not just something you get on a Delta flight, get off the plane, you know, transfer in Texas, and then go down to San Pedro Sula, Honduras, and then get on a bus, and then, you know, just get on, you know, get to the end of the road, you get on a boat, and then you take the boat all the way down out to this area, this region of Honduras. It's not that easy. It took a long process for me to get to the spirit that we're talking about, because what I had to do was to strip myself. They're talking about stripping the soul. I think I had to strip away a lot of my upbringing and my way of seeing things. And what happened first was my first trip to Guatemala, and I was in Antigua, which is a gringo kind of town, a lot of students from all over the world studying Spanish. There's Berkeley graduates speaking poetry night, you know, especially. I'm like, I didn't come here to Guatemala to sit around and talk poetry. So I went to an extreme thing out to the highlands of Guatemala, living with the Maya Kikchi. I got on another one of these buses going down a dirt road all alone, just the gringo backpack, me in the back seat of this thing, and a whole bus full of you know, locals from this village. Somebody told me to go there. I had no guidebook. I spoke decent Spanish at that time, but this was an indigenous language. So I get to this village, and of course, I've seen movies, you know, what do you do? Are these people going to attack me? Are they going to boil me in the thing, you know? And no, you have to work through this stuff to realize this is just really a beautiful village, but you also have to respect what they're doing and figure out what they're doing. You know, you can't bring you there. You have to eat their food. You have to sleep where they sleep. You have to subsist around them. You have to learn how to get along with people when they speak a totally different language. And I was not prepared for that. And I had a horrible experience, and I ended up, because I ate some pork, and I had an incredible experience going out to this sacred spot, this waterfall. It's called Semuk Champe, which is now a national park where all kinds of tourists go. But at the time, there was none of that. It was just a place that I'd heard of, and only the local indigenous people knew about. And it was this river goes underground and into these incredible caves, and above it, there's these cascading waterfalls. And the reason I went to this region of Alta Verapaz is it's the setting of the mythological creation story of the Maya Quiche. So it's called the Popol Vuh. So I was reading these stories, and that's the place where underground lives the spirit of the world. That's where God lives. And it's the translation in Maya Kekchi was Mountain Valley. And they actually it's a region of, it's limestone caves, and you go, there's just caves and waterfalls and incredible underground world there. But unfortunately, as I said, I was ill-prepared to, even though I was amazed in wonderment, but I ended up with trichinosis. I left the village because I ate pork that was not well cooked. I ate in the little village, in the center of the village, which turned out, I saw these worms like speeding through the pork that I was eating. And so it was a pretty horrible experience. And then learning, I went back to Guatemala City to heal myself. It's a much longer story, but I healed myself through that, and went back to the States, and I got a real job for a while working for Disney. Anyways, yeah.
Did you know when you were there, did you start journaling? Were you already writing a book, or
yeah,
at what point did you intend to write when you went?
100% I was there to write, but I was so much in the situation of learning how to be there, and I made so many mistakes that I realized I have to figure this out. So what I did is, a few years later, I planned a full year off, and I did that same thing. I got on a bus and traveled all the way, and this time I was headed to South America, but instead I ended up on the Mosquito Coast of Honduras and Nicaragua, but mainly Honduras in this situation. And to get there, I made a deal with myself. You can't just go in and drop in and think you know what you're doing. You have to befriend the locals. You have to follow. You have to do what they do. You have to have somebody who you trust, who's a local, to guide you. Don't just walk into a village where you don't know, because people can rob you, people can kill you, you can disappear. It can be an extremely dangerous place. It can also be the most wonderful place you'll ever go to. And I think I've experienced both. And so it took a month to get out to the Mosquito Coast, because I went to the end of the road in coastal Caribbean Honduras and met a local Mosquito guy who said, come on with us. And I was with 3 other gringos, and it took 2 weeks for his cousin's boat to come. And we waded out into the Caribbean and got on this boat like in the middle of the night, and these crazy sailors. And it became like, I ended up spending 6 months there, and I was only going to go out and visit it. And I went into these villages where there's a whole world. It's completely separate. There's no roads. There's very little electricity, very few roads, very little electricity. It's changing rapidly now, but and so it was sort of, I grew up in Massachusetts under the influence of Thoreau. It was what I wanted to do. I wanted to go to a place where there were no roads, because roads, fossil fuels, you know, electricity, power, global warming, all these things, you know, the destruction of the environment. So can you live without, was my question. And, you know, so that's when I started writing this novel that is now finished, and that was a long time ago. I actually wrote 2 novels going this way and that before I could actually take on this issue. But, and I was studying, you know, Matt talks a lot about the curanderos, the shamanisms. They have different names with the mosquito, and the bush medicine, the medicine of the plants. And the interesting thing about the mosquito is they're a mix between African and indigenous, with a lot of Spaniard and pirate. So it's a melding of many cultures. So they're very welcoming to somebody who is an outsider like me. So, and because I slept on the floor. You know, you have basically a mosquito net. You eat a very stripped down diet of whatever is available, and you don't complain. There's mosquitoes everywhere, swarms of them, and people just light little fires and survive with them. But the forest, as you go upriver in this area, it gets wilder and wilder, and out into a place where there, at that time, and there's a lot of things changing right now, and that's a big issue with what I've written. But at that time, I was lucky enough to go to a place where there was no logging, there was no people, there were no roads. I got to these villages where it was really the other side of something that we haven't experienced in this country for 200 whatever years. So.
Yeah, wow. So when we're addressing spiritual-based undertakings in your writing, did either of you realize that you were going to explore this new terrain, this new country, the new environmental or the old environmental scenario? Did either of you set out to write a spiritual book, or did the spiritual books emerge out of the experience? What came first? Matt, take it.
Well, I've always been obsessed with truth, and truth, how can I put this? Truth and spirit, in my humble opinion. Everything I talk about is in my universe, doesn't have to apply to you. But in my universe, truth is synonymous with beauty and divinity. And if you study, I always like to say, I got a book down there based on sacred geometry called The Infinity Zone, which got very much inspired during a lot of ayahuasca journeys. And I've come to some realizations through and I've studied with lots of different people, and I've been a few different tribes. And I've come to some real basic realizations of life, and they kind of go hand in hand. Actually, Aline said this earlier in her own way. Love is expansion, and fear is contraction. And in what I've discovered for me is that fear and death are my 2 greatest teachers. And I'm here to tell you, I've died many, many times now with some of my experiences in the jungle and some of the shit they put me through. which I don't regret because it always makes me better in the end. So my writing sprung from a desire to speak truth. If you really, if you study, a lot of my early stuff was Twilight Zone inspired, and even a really truly good horror story, or that kind of story, is actually a morality tale. You do this shit, you do that, something bad's gonna happen. I mean, that was that acid story that I wrote, or it wasn't acid, but the whole peaking and not stopping. The guy didn't respect the powers that he was dealing with, and that's a big thing. So they are one and the same, and I'll just say this and I'll pass it back to you. Aside from all the years of working with the ayahuasca, I was also working with a personal coach. Very high level. She worked with tons of big Hollywood people and everything else. And any of her other clients who worked with ayahuasca, she would tell them, don't do that, stop, it's not helping you, and don't do it. For me, she was like, keep doing it, keep doing it. And it took me 3-4 years to work the two. You can appreciate this from what you studied. But it took me a while to bring them both together and realize that I was working the same process from 2 different ways. But once I figured that out and got it working, things started to really click. I'll leave it at that because I want to give Jeff some time too. But.
So the spirit, did you set out to write a spiritual book, or did it just emerge? How?
Oh, well, I would say I set out to write a spiritual book, but I didn't know what it was. And I knew that, because I was studying the stories, the ancient mythology, as I mentioned, the Popol Vuh from Guatemala. This region of Honduras is much more taking after Amazonian mythology, because they are related to the South American tribes from Venezuela, from Colombia, and from the Caribbean. And so those stories of South America are much more, because when you go into their forest, the incredible thing that you learn from these myths is that you can learn so much about the natural world there, because they bring the animals and the plants and the life of the place. It is an animist way of looking at the world, meaning everything is alive. And you only realize that when you are in the forest and you look out. And okay, you mentioned, you know, I wasn't this isn't a region where you know, these plant medicines like ayahuasca are around. But there was other things going on there. I got involved with people who were you know, brujas, or they call them in Mexico, in Mesquite, sukyas, and I was studying the medicine, which because I saw a lot of really interesting, beautiful, and sometimes scary things. It's also related to African, you know, the Santeria, or in Haiti, the voodoo, where these African religions, because on the coast, on the Caribbean coast, it's very African. And they, as you go further in, they mix, and so their spiritual traditions have mixed as well. And a lot of those slave ships carried plants. The people carried plants from their home and brought them to the shores there, and so they planted these different plants. And so there's things that happen that people can do to you if you're not careful. And it's all a situation, if you study, and I had to go to Haiti to learn about these things, because Haiti's a more pure